Leech and lime first. That was the smell of the room where it started, and it never really left after that. Not from her hands, not from the story, not from him. The device sat bolted to the underside of a lacquered table in a back room that smelled of clove smoke and wet concrete, 22 minutes from doing something no amount of money could undo. 9 men in good suits stood very still, the way men stand when they have finally understood that their guns are furniture. Somewhere behind them, a busboy's abandoned tray of half-melted ice dripped steadily onto tile that hadn't been mopped since the dinner rush, a small, indifferent sound in a room otherwise holding its breath. The only person moving was a woman in a hairnet and a stained apron, on her knees in a puddle of ice melt, her hand already inside the wiring before anyone told her she was allowed to touch it. She wasn't supposed to be in that room. She wasn't supposed to know what she was looking at. She wasn't supposed to be anything but the woman who scraped the plates. It wasn't heroism. It was Tuesday, and Tuesday needed to end. 3 weeks earlier, Marisol Vega's whole life fit into the space between a bus schedule and a sink. The apartment on Alvarado smelled like other people's cooking through thin walls, fried onions from 4B, menthol cigarettes from the stairwell, and her own place smelled like nothing at all, because she couldn't afford the kind of soap that left a smell behind. She owned 4 shirts, 2 that fit and 2 that used to. She owned a mattress on a frame she'd found on the curb on trash day, a lamp with no shade, and a cat named Sergeant, who required a very specific diabetic food that cost $11 a can, food she bought 4 cans of and stretched across 2 weeks by mixing it with rice she didn't eat herself. She was 34 years old, and her hands had gone permanently pink and cracked from dish detergent, the good kind burning her skin the same as the bad kind, because the restaurant bought whatever was cheapest that month. Her back had a particular ache that lived just under the left shoulder blade, an old souvenir from a different life, and it flared every time she reached for the top rack of the industrial washer. She didn't mention it. Nobody asked. Rent was $1,040. She had $800. She was $340 short, and the landlord, a man named Petrosian, who wore the same grey cardigan every single day of the year, had already slid a yellow notice under her door twice this month, the paper going soft and translucent from the humidity in the hallway. The restaurant was called El Fosforo, the Match, a name someone must have thought was clever 20 years ago, before the paint peeled and the neon N started buzzing like a trapped fly. She worked the graveyard shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, scraping plates for men who came in long after the kitchen had technically closed, men who tipped the cook in cash and never once looked at the woman standing at the steel sink 6 feet away, up to her elbows in grey water, invisible as the drain. Her manager, Lou, a heavy-set man who smelled permanently of fryer oil and spearmint gum, liked to say her name wrong on purpose. Maricela, Maritza, once, memorably, Melissa. She'd stopped correcting him in her second week. "You're basically furniture back there," he told her once, not unkindly, the way you'd say a table was sturdy. Furniture that does dishes. She didn't argue. Furniture didn't need severance. Furniture didn't need benefits. Furniture didn't need anyone to remember that 6 years ago she used to kneel over things that could kill a room full of people in under a second, and that her hands, before they were dishwasher's hands, had been the kind of steady that saved lives for a living, until the day they didn't, and the army decided it had used her up. She fed Sergeant his $11 can, split 3 ways across the week, and watched him eat like it was a full portion, and she went to sleep at 9 in the morning to the sound of a bus grinding its brakes outside her window, and that was her whole life, folded up small enough to fit in a 1-room apartment that smelled like nothing at all. Petrosian came by on Tuesdays, always Tuesdays, in the grey cardigan that had a hole at the left elbow he refused to acknowledge, and he never knocked so much as scratched at the door with 2 knuckles, a sound she'd learned to dread more than any siren. He wasn't cruel. That was the strange part. He simply had a ledger in his head, with no room in it for excuses, and he recited the numbers the way a man recites a weather report. Flat, factual, no personal stake in whether it rained. 1140, he said. The 3rd Tuesday in a row he'd said it. You're at 800. I'm aware. I have people who pay on time, whole families, waiting. I'm aware of that too. He looked past her once, into the apartment, at the mattress on the floor and the lamp with no shade and the cat dish licked clean an hour before it should have been, and something crossed his face that might have been pity if he'd had room in the ledger for it. He didn't. He slid the yellow paper under the door anyway, the same paper, softening at the corners now from humidity and handling, and left without another word, his loafers slapping down the hallway in a rhythm she could have set a clock to. At El Fosforo the next night, Lou found her elbow-deep in a sink of grey water and told her, around a wad of spearmint gum, that the walk-in cooler needed restocking, and the register needed counting, and could she do both before her shift technically started, since she was already there anyway. And no, there wasn't overtime for that. Overtime was for people whose names he remembered correctly the first time. Maricela, he added, walking away, not noticing he'd gotten it wrong again. You're a lifesaver. She didn't correct him. She never did. There was a particular exhaustion in being called the wrong name so many times that correcting it started to feel like more effort than the 4 extra letters were worth, and she had learned, the hard way, in more than one uniform, that some battles cost more than the ground they won. She thought, sometimes, standing at that sink at 2 in the morning, with her hands gone numb from the water and her back singing its familiar old song, about the version of herself that used to kneel over things that could kill a room full of people, who had been trusted, once, with judgment calls that mattered, who had a rank and a specialty and a team that knew her actual name. That woman felt like a stranger she'd read about in a file. The woman at the sink was the one who paid rent, or tried to. The medical board had used words like residual instability and unfit for continued field designation, phrases she'd read so many times on the discharge paperwork that they'd stopped meaning anything, the way a word repeated enough times turns into just a sound. Nobody on that board had asked her if she wanted to keep doing the work anyway, differently, quietly, on her own terms. Nobody asked because the paperwork had already decided the answer for her, the way paperwork tends to, filed by people who would never have to live inside the consequences of what they'd checked a box for. She'd tried, for the first year after, to find work that used any part of what she knew, private security, contract consulting, even a call center that wanted former military for a fraud detection line that turned out to have nothing to do with anything she'd trained for. And each door had closed the same way, politely, with the same 3 words rearranged: overqualified, underqualified, or simply not hiring. Somewhere between the 14th rejection and the 20th, she'd stopped mentioning the 6 years at all on applications, because the 6 years seemed to make people nervous in a way that flatly not having them didn't. El Fosforo had never asked about her history. That was, in its own bleak way, the whole appeal. Cedar and gun oil moved into a room before Nazario Cruz did, which was its own kind of warning, if you knew to read it. At 2:58 that Tuesday morning, in a back room he owned but never let anyone call his, Nazario sat across from 4 men from Tijuana who wanted a bigger cut of a shipment lane that ran through 3 counties and 1 very corrupt harbor inspector. He did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice in 11 years, not since a rival made him do it once, in front of people, and paid for the privilege with everything he had, including, eventually, his life. The 4 men from Tijuana were sweating despite the air conditioning. That was the tell. Danger, in that room, was measured in other men's sweat, never in Nazario's volume. "You have 11 minutes to decide," he said, and set his watch face up on the table, a gesture so small it should not have mattered, and mattered enormously. After that, the number goes down, not up. The number in question was $240,000, and the 11 minutes were real, because Nazario's flight to Guadalajara left at 4:15, and he did not miss flights, on principle, the same principle by which he did not raise his voice. The lead man from Tijuana, a wiry man named Osvaldo with a gold tooth that caught the light strangely, tried a joke. Nazario did not laugh. Nobody in the room laughed. The joke died in the air, the way jokes died around him, quickly, and without ceremony. Fermin, who had worked the door for 6 years and had, in that time, seen exactly 2 men raise a hand to Nazario Cruz, and exactly 2 men stopped breathing shortly afterward, kept his eyes on the middle distance the way soldiers are trained to during an inspection, present but unwilling to be a variable. Chewy, younger, newer, hadn't learned that trick yet, and his eyes kept flicking to the door, then to the watch, then to Nazario's folded hands, then back to the door, a nervous metronome nobody commented on, because commenting on it would have meant admitting they felt the same thing. It wasn't fear of a gun. Nazario rarely carried one. He'd said once, to no one in particular, that a man who needed to hold a weapon to be believed had already lost the argument. It was fear of the quiet, the specific, cultivated quiet of a man who had built an empire on never needing to raise his voice, because everyone around him had learned, at some cost, exactly what came after the quiet ran out. Osvaldo's gold tooth caught the light again as he tried a second angle, softer this time, appealing to shared history, mutual respect, the old days. Nazario let him finish. He always let people finish. It cost him nothing and told him everything. 10 minutes, he said, when Osvaldo stopped talking, as if the appeal had never happened at all. His men, Fermin at the door, Chewy by the register, 2 more he didn't bother learning the names of that week, did not look at Osvaldo. They looked at Nazario's hands, which were folded on the table, still, patient, the hands of a man who had never once needed to reach for anything, because the reaching had already been done for him by 20 years of other people's fear. Cold arithmetic, $240,000, 11 minutes, 4 men with families in Tijuana, who would find out within the hour whether their families would eat well this year or not at all. Nobody in that room needed him to shout. The math did the shouting for him. At 3:04, with 7 minutes left on a watch nobody dared to check but him, one of Nazario's men, a 19-year-old named Iker, who ran deliveries and wasn't supposed to be near this room at all, walked in from the alley, holding a flashlight at a strange angle, and said 4 words that made the temperature of the room drop without the thermostat moving. "There's something under the table." Nazario had built everything he owned on a single principle, learned the hard way at 19, when a man he'd trusted put a bullet in his father's chest, over a debt that amounted, in the end, to $1,100. Never let anyone see you need anything, because the moment they see the need, they own a piece of you, cheaper than they should have had to pay for it. He had spent 2 decades making sure nobody ever saw him need anything again. Not money, not loyalty, not even air, if you asked the men who'd watched him hold his breath through gunfire once without so much as blinking. He had never, in that entire time, needed to be rescued. That fact sat somewhere underneath everything that happened next, a fact he did not yet know was about to stop being true. The line got crossed at 11 minutes past 3, and it got crossed on her knees. Mari had come in through the kitchen's back door at 3:06, running late because the 7:04 bus had broken an axle 2 stops before hers, and she was still tying her apron when Lou grabbed her by the arm hard enough to leave a mark and said, in a voice she'd never heard him use, that they needed everybody out. Now, there was a problem in the back room, some kind of device. Call the police. Call the police. Why isn't anyone calling the police? She looked past him through the swinging door. Under the lacquered table, where a man in a grey suit sat with his hands folded like he was praying, a metal box the size of a toaster was zip-tied to the underside of the wood, 4 wires running from it in colours that meant something very specific to exactly one person standing in that kitchen. A timer on its face, small and green and merciless, was counting down from a number that made her stomach drop the way it used to drop, years ago, in a country whose name she still didn't say out loud. 19 minutes. Then 18. Everyone else in that room saw a bomb and understood, correctly, that it was time to run. She saw a bomb and understood, with the specific, terrible clarity of 6 years of training that had never once fully left her hands, no matter how many dishes she'd scraped since, that running wasn't actually the only option. It was just the option that didn't require her. She was already moving before she decided to. That was the part nobody who wasn't trained for it ever understood, that the moving came first and the deciding came after, like a body remembering something the mind had tried very hard to forget. "Everybody out," she said. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her more than anything else that night. Nazario Cruz looked at her, really looked, for the first time, at the woman in the hairnet who 6 minutes ago had not existed in his field of vision at all, and said nothing, because there was, for the first time in a very long time, nothing to say. Silence. The kind that has weight, the kind you can hear your own pulse inside of. Move, she said again, to him specifically, and something in the way she said it made even Fermin at the door step back, though he could not have explained why. She went down on her knees in a puddle of ice melt from a dropped bus tray and put her hands where 6 years ago they would have gone without a second thought, and the room, 9 armed men, 1 cartel boss, 1 19-year-old with a flashlight, went dead silent, because there was nothing left to do but watch a dishwasher decide whether they lived. Lou hovered at the swinging door, torn between the instinct to drag her out by the collar and the older, deeper instinct that told him not to interrupt whatever was happening in that room. He chose, in the end, to do neither, which was its own kind of decision. "Somebody get everyone past the kitchen line," Mari said, without looking up, her voice gone flat and procedural in a way none of them had heard from her before, a voice that belonged to someone who used to give orders to people twice her size and expect them followed. Now, not the door, the alley. If I'm wrong about this, the door's the worst place to be standing. Nobody asked her how she knew that. Nobody, in that moment, doubted it either. 15 minutes. 14. She didn't explain the wires. She didn't narrate. She traced them with 2 fingers, cataloguing, the way you'd read a face you used to know, and somewhere in the traced silence, the number on the timer stopped being the loudest thing in the room, and her own heartbeat took over that job instead. Her shoulder screamed at the angle she was holding it, the old injury waking up exactly when she needed it least, and she breathed through it the way she'd been taught. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, a rhythm that had nothing to do with calm, and everything to do with keeping her hands from betraying her. 10 minutes. She had stopped hearing the room entirely by then. No chairs scraping, no breathing, nothing but the small mechanical hum of a device built by someone who had wanted this moment to matter to as many people as possible. It wasn't bravery. It was muscle memory with the volume turned all the way up. At 6 seconds past 4 minutes remaining, she made a choice with her hands that 6 years of training had bought, and 1 apron had almost buried, and the green numbers on the timer's face went dark. Silence again. A different kind. The kind that means you're still alive and haven't quite believed it yet. Nazario Cruz, a man who had not raised his voice in 11 years and had not been surprised by anything in considerably longer than that, said the only 2 words he had left in him. "Who are you?" It wasn't a question. It didn't have the shape of one, but it was the first time in his life he'd said anything without already knowing the answer. The room exhaled all at once, the specific collective exhale of 9 armed men, remembering, almost sheepishly, that they had lungs. Osvaldo's men from Tijuana had already backed against the far wall, forgetting entirely about the $240,000, forgetting the 11 minutes that had somehow, impossibly, become 19 minutes, and then a diffused metal box sitting inert on the floor tile. Lou finally pushed through the swinging door, saw the box, saw Mari still on her knees in the ice melt, and made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a word. "Maricela," he said, then caught himself, genuinely, for the first time. Mari, what? How did you—" "I need a mop," she said, standing, her knees soaked through, her hands finally starting to shake now that there was nothing left for them to do. "And nobody's calling the police?" "Not yet. Not until somebody tells me what happens to the woman who just found a bomb in a restaurant that launders money for a man everybody's too scared to name out loud." Nobody answered that. Nazario watched her the way you watch weather changing direction, recalculating something behind his eyes that had taken 11 years to build and had just, in the space of 19 minutes, been quietly rearranged. "Go home," he said finally to her, in the same flat register he'd used on Osvaldo minutes before. "Someone will call you a car. I take the bus. Not tonight." She didn't have the energy left to argue with that particular sentence, and so, for the first time in longer than she could remember, She let someone else's money solve a problem instead of her own 2 hands. Morning arrived the way it always did on that block, grey and exhausted, smelling of wet asphalt and the particular sourness of a dumpster 3 days past its pickup. Mari walked home like nothing had happened, because as far as the police report was concerned, nothing had. Lou had called it in as a faulty gas line, at somebody's quiet suggestion, and the 4 men from Tijuana had left with their $240,000 intact and their opinions about Nazario Cruz's reach considerably revised. She fed Sergeant his rationed can, lay down on the curb mattress, and stared at the water stain on her ceiling that looked, if you squinted, like the coast of somewhere she'd never been. Her hands, she noticed, had finally stopped shaking around hour 2. By midnight the next day, the air outside her building smelled like rain that hadn't decided to fall yet, and a black car she recognized. She'd been trained to recognize things once. That skill hadn't left her either. Idled outside for 40 minutes before anyone got out of it. Fermin, the man from the door, knocked twice, waited, knocked once more. "He wants to talk to you," he said, when she opened the door 6 inches and no further. "Not here, somewhere with chairs. I have chairs. Somewhere with better chairs." She went, mostly because Sergeant needed a 5th can of that $11 food and arithmetic. Unlike Pride, does not negotiate. The office smelled like cedar and gun oil before she'd even sat down, and underneath it, faintly, cigars nobody in the room was currently smoking. Old smoke, soaked into the walls the way certain histories soak into a person and never fully air out. Nazario didn't stand when she entered. He didn't offer his hand. He gestured at a chair that had, in fact, cost more than everything Mari owned combined, and waited until she sat before he spoke. "Army," he said. "Not a question." 6 years, EOD. She hadn't said those 2 letters out loud in 4 years, and they came out of her mouth like something rusty finally turning. "And now you wash dishes. And now I wash dishes." He studied her the way he studied ledgers, looking for the number that didn't add up, and found, apparently, nothing he could argue with. "I want to offer you a job. I have a job. You have a job that pays you to be furniture." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd meant it as an insult. "I'm offering you a job that pays you to be exactly what you are." "What am I?" "Useful," he said, in a way almost nobody left alive, still is. She named a number in her head, the number she owed Petrosian, the number of cans of cat food, the number of buses that broke their axles on schedules nobody controlled, and she still said no, because 6 years of training had also taught her the second most important lesson of her life, right after how to read a wire. Read the whole deal before you sign anything. "No offense," she said, "but I don't do unlicensed work for men who own back rooms with bombs under the tables. That's not a job. That's a federal sentence with better lighting." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It had the shape one might grow into, eventually, with practice. 2,000 a week, he said. "Cash. You disappear the second it's not worth it to you." "Taxes," she said. He blinked. Of every response available to a man in his position, that was apparently not one he'd rehearsed for. "You want to pay me under the table for defusing bombs under other tables," she said, "and you're surprised I asked about taxes." Most people don't ask about taxes. Most people don't have a landlord named Petrosian. He almost laughed. It came out as an exhale through the nose, which for Nazario Cruz was apparently the emotional equivalent of a standing ovation. "No," she said, standing, smoothing down an apron she was technically still wearing under her coat because she hadn't had time to change. "I have a job. I have a cat. I have a landlord who slides yellow paper under my door, and I don't intend to give him a reason to slide anything worse. Thank you for the chair." "You disarmed a device built to kill 9 men in a room you weren't invited into," Nazario said, still seated, still unbothered, the way a man speaks when he already suspects the conversation isn't over. "And your objection is my paperwork." "My objection is everything about you," she said. "The paperwork's just the part I can put a number on. Everything has a number. Not this." She left anyway. It was, she would later think, the single most expensive decision of her life, and also the only one available to a person who still wanted to recognize herself in a mirror. She went back to El Fosforo the next night like nothing had changed, tied the same apron, stood at the same sink, let the same grey water run hot over her cracked hands, and told herself, scraping a plate of half-eaten mole that some stranger had abandoned along with a decent tip, that this was the correct decision, the honest decision, the decision a person could sleep on top of without waking up owing anyone anything but rent. Lou called her Maricela twice that shift. She didn't correct him. The old life fit the same as it always had, which was to say, badly, but familiarly, the way a shoe that's worn through at the heel still goes on the foot because it's the only shoe you own. Sergeant's blood sugar crashed on a Sunday 2 weeks later, in the specific silent way that diabetic cats crash. No warning bark or whine, just a slow refusal to get up off the bathroom tile that Mari didn't notice until she'd already left for work and come home 7 hours later to find him exactly where she'd left him, breathing too fast, eyes gone glassy in a way that made her stomach fold in on itself. The emergency vet on 6th wanted $400 up front before they'd even look at him, no exceptions. A policy printed on a laminated card the receptionist held up like a shield. Mari had $81 in her checking account and a credit card maxed out since March. She sat in the parking lot with Sergeant crying in his carrier on the passenger seat of a car she didn't own. She'd borrowed it from a neighbor, another small debt added to a ledger already too full. And she did the arithmetic one more time. The same arithmetic that never once, in her whole life, had come out in her favor without somebody else's money filling the gap. She called the number Fermín had given her. It rang twice. "I need an advance," she said, before he could even say hello. "Not a favor, an advance. Against work I haven't done yet." There was a pause on the line, and then Fermín's voice, careful. "Give me 10 minutes. $600 appeared, in cash, in an envelope handed to her by a teenager on a bicycle outside the vet's office within 22 minutes. No explanation attached, beyond a note in handwriting she didn't recognize yet, but would come to. Cats don't wait for pride to sort itself out. N. Sergeant lived. The vet said another 6 hours, and he wouldn't have. Mari sat in the waiting room, holding a cat carrier and an envelope with $200 left in it, and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has just watched pride lose an argument to arithmetic, that she was no longer negotiating from a position where no was actually an option. She called the black car's number back that same night. $2,000 a week, she said. Cash. I want it clear, in writing, in a language even a public defender could understand, that I'm a contractor, not an employee, and I choose my jobs. He said you'd say something like that, Fermín said. Tell him I want dental too. Fermín, for the first time since she'd met him, actually laughed. A short, surprised bark of a sound, quickly swallowed. I'll tell him. She gave Lou 2 weeks' notice, which he didn't seem to register as real until her last night, when he finally called her by the correct name for the first and only time, as if the effort had only ever been worth spending on someone who was leaving anyway. Marisol, he said, at the end of her final shift, almost gently, you're better than this place. I know, she said, and untied her apron for the last time, and didn't feel the relief she'd expected to feel, because 6 years of training had also taught her that better places came with worse weather, and she was about to find out exactly how bad the forecast could get. Her first week on Nazario's payroll paid her $3,000, a signing bonus, Fermín called it, though nobody signed anything, because nothing about the arrangement existed on paper by design, and she used every dollar of it on Petrosian, on Sergeant's proper food bought in bulk for the first time in 3 years, and on a mattress that came with an actual frame, delivered by 2 men who looked faintly terrified when they saw the return address on their invoice. She told herself, folding the receipt into a drawer she'd never needed before because she'd never had enough paper worth keeping, that this was temporary, a bridge, a way to breathe until she found something cleaner. She had told herself variations of that sentence before, about other decisions, and she noticed, folding the receipt, that the sentence was starting to sound less like a plan and more like a habit. By midnight most weeks, the air around the warehouses she now worked out of smelled of diesel exhaust and the particular sourness of produce gone soft in unrefrigerated heat, a smell she'd grown almost fond of, the way soldiers grow fond of the smell of their own gear, not because it was pleasant, but because it meant the work was still hers to do. 2 weeks into the arrangement, Nazario asked her to do something that had nothing to do with wires. "Kui's brother owes money," he said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk with an address on it. "I need someone to go remind him the debt exists." "You're good at making people go quiet." "I make bombs go quiet," she said, not touching the paper. "That's a different skill from making a person go quiet, and you know it, and I think you're testing to see if I'll pretend not to notice the difference." He didn't deny it. That was, she was starting to learn, the closest thing he had to an apology. "I don't do collections," she said. "I don't do intimidation. I don't touch anything that isn't wired to hurt somebody who isn't already trying to hurt somebody first. That's the whole deal. If the deal changes, I walk, and you can find yourself another dishwasher with a rare skill set. Good luck with that particular ad." "There isn't another one." "Then the deal doesn't change." He folded the paper back up, slower than the motion needed to be, and something that might have been respect settled into the line of his mouth. "Understood," he said, and never asked her again, not once, for anything that didn't come with a timer attached. There were 4 smaller jobs before the one that mattered. A device taped under a payphone nobody used anymore, except to send messages nobody wanted traced, diffused in 11 minutes flat, while a bored teenager filmed her from across the street on a phone he wasn't supposed to have out. A package left on a loading dock that turned out to be nothing at all, just a rival's cheap theater, and she'd stood there at 4 in the morning, feeling faintly foolish, in a bulletproof vest, 2 sizes too big for her, laughing once, short and surprised, at the absurdity of having been afraid of a box of rice cookers. A car in a parking structure downtown, rigged sloppily by someone in a hurry. Done in 6 minutes, because sloppy work read easy to someone trained to read the careful kind. A warehouse fire that turned out to be an accident. No device at all, just bad wiring, and worse luck, and she'd stood outside watching it burn, feeling something close to relief, that for once, nobody had built this specifically to hurt anyone. Each time, Fermín picked her up in the black car and dropped her home before sunrise, and each time she added the cash to an envelope in a drawer that used to hold nothing and now held, for the first time in her adult life, more money than she owed anyone. Each time, she told herself this was the last one. Each time, the next call came anyway, and she answered it, because some part of her, the part that used to wear a rank, the part that used to matter to people who signed real paperwork, had missed being needed more than she'd ever let herself admit, standing at a sink, scraping someone else's dinner off a plate. The second test came 6 weeks later, in a warehouse outside Bakersfield that smelled of diesel and orange rot from crates gone bad in the heat, where a rival named Hector Salcido had left a very different kind of present wired into a shipment of refrigerated trucks. A message, not a threat. The kind of message that says, "I could have killed 40 men today and chose, instead, to let you find out how close I came." 6 trucks, 1 device per truck, staggered timers, no 2 wired the same way, because Hector liked games and had heard, by then, what had happened at El Fosforo, and had built something specifically to see if the woman who'd embarrassed his rival could really do what people said. A phone had been left taped to the inside of the first truck's door, screen already lit, a number blocked, but a voice on the other end unmistakably enjoying itself. "You must be the dishwasher," Hector said, when Fermín answered it on speaker, his voice smooth in the particular way of men who have never once needed to raise it either, though for entirely different reasons than Nazario's. "I built these for Nazario. Consider you a bonus round." 6 trucks, Mari said, not looking up from the panel in front of her. "That's a lot of hardware for a message. I like being thorough. You like being scared he's not scared enough of you yet. Thorough's just the word you use for it." There was a pause on the line, a small, offended silence, the kind that told her she'd landed somewhere true. "Nazario found himself a mouth to go with the hands," Hector said finally. "Careful, dishwasher. Mouths get people killed faster than hands do. Funny, she said, cutting the first wire clean, the truck's small red light finally going dark. That's exactly what my old commanding officer used to say. He's also dead. Draw your own conclusions about how much either of those things actually helped him. Fermín ended the call without waiting for a response, and the two of them worked the remaining trucks in a silence that felt, for the first time that night, less like fear and more like two people quietly enjoying having won an argument neither of them had technically been in the room for. Mari worked truck by truck in 90-degree heat, with sweat running into her eyes and her back screaming under the old injury, calling out numbers and colors to Fermín, who fed them back to her when her hands were too deep inside a panel to check twice, and by the fifth truck, her voice had gone rough and mechanical, purely functional, the voice of someone who had stopped being afraid 3 trucks ago, because fear, it turned out, was a luxury that ran out before the adrenaline did. She found the traitor on the 6th truck, not a bomb, a tracker, cheap, badly hidden, tucked into a wheel well by someone who'd had access to the loading manifest and had sold that access for considerably less than it was worth. "Whose truck is this?" she asked, holding the tracker up between 2 fingers like something dead. Nazario, who had come himself this time, in a suit that would never survive the diesel smell it was currently absorbing, looked at the manifest Fermín handed him and read one name off it, quietly, the way he read everything. Ika, he said, the 19-year-old, the one who'd found the first bomb, months ago, with a flashlight held at a strange angle. Nobody in the warehouse said anything for a long moment. Somewhere, a diesel generator kept running, indifferent. "Take him somewhere quiet," Nazario said, in the same tone he might have used to order lunch. "Make sure he understands the difference between selling information and selling loyalty. Then let him go home. He's 19. 19-year-olds get one mistake before it becomes a habit." It should have chilled her. It did chill her, the offhandedness of it, the fact that mercy and menace came out of his mouth, using the identical, unbothered register, and it was the first time she let herself admit, standing in that heat with a tracker still warm in her palm, that the man terrified her precisely because he never needed to raise his voice to be terrifying. Fermín drove her home that night in a silence that felt companionable rather than heavy, the radio playing low, some cumbia station fading in and out through the mountains, and somewhere around the second gas station he finally spoke. "You know he doesn't do this for everyone," he said. "The showing up himself, the watching. Do what? Come to the small jobs, the trucks. He usually sends me and stays in the city." Fermín glanced at her sideways, the way a man does when he's deciding whether to say the rest of a sentence out loud. "He came to Bakersfield himself. He hasn't done that since I've worked for him. Maybe he likes diesel fumes." "Maybe," Fermín said, and let it drop, though the small smile on his face said he didn't believe his own maybe any more than she did. "You're not going to kill him," she said. It came out somewhere between a question and a relief she hadn't asked permission to feel. "I don't kill 19-year-olds for being poor and stupid," Nazario said. "I kill grown men for being disloyal on purpose. There's a difference. Most people in my business forget it." "Comforting," she said, in the way a loaded gun on the table is comforting. "You'd know." She did. That was the trouble. They drove back from Bakersfield in separate cars, but Nazario stopped outside her building anyway, at an hour when the block smelled of rain that had already fallen and asphalt still steaming faintly from it, and he rolled the window down himself instead of letting Fermín do it. "You did good work today," he said. It was, she realized, the first time he'd complimented anything about her that wasn't strictly transactional. "I disarmed 6 bombs and got a 19-year-old a beating instead of a funeral. I'm not sure good is the word I'd choose." "What word would you choose?" She thought about it, standing on the curb with her hands still faintly trembling from adrenaline that hadn't fully drained yet. "Necessary," she said. "Good implies I had better options." "Did you?" "No," she admitted. "That's what makes it necessary instead of good." He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd suspected about her for a while, and told her to get some sleep, and didn't drive away until she was actually inside the building, which she noticed. and filed away next to all the other small things about him that didn't add up the way a man in his position was supposed to add up. The drink happened 3 nights later, in the back office that smelled of cedar and gun oil and old unsmoked cigars, at an hour when even Fermin had gone home and the building had settled into the particular quiet that only comes after violence has been narrowly avoided rather than committed. Nazario poured 2 glasses of something dark and expensive without asking if she wanted any, which she noted and did not entirely mind. "You have a scar," he said, nodding at her wrist, where a thin white line ran diagonal, old, faded almost to nothing. "EOD doesn't give you that kind." "Motorcycle. Before the army, I was 17 and an idiot." "I was 15 and an idiot," he said. "Different scar, same reason." He reached across the desk and with 2 fingers touched the line on her wrist. Not a grab, not a claim, just contact. Brief and deliberate. The kind of touch that asks a question without using any words to do it. She didn't pull away. That surprised her more than the bomb had. "You come from dirt," he said. It wasn't an insult. It landed like the opposite of one. "Same as you. Same as me," he agreed. And for the first time since she'd met him, something in his face wasn't calculating anything at all. "Most people who work for me have never been hungry. Not really. You have. I still am. Some weeks. Not anymore. You say that like you bought it. You didn't buy it. You just made the number bigger. Same thing, in my experience." "It's not," she said, and something in her voice had gone quieter, less like an argument, and more like an actual answer. "Money doesn't fix hungry. It just moves it further away for a while. I know because I've had money before. Briefly. Twice. And both times I spent the whole time waiting for it to leave again. It always did." Nazario turned his glass slowly on the desk, not drinking from it, watching the ice catch the low light. "My mother used to say something like that. Different words. Same math. Where is she now? Dead 11 years. Same year I stopped raising my voice." He said it the way he said everything. Flat. Factual. No invitation attached to grieve alongside him. And she didn't try to. Some doors, she'd learned. You don't push on just because they're slightly open. "Don't," she said, though her pulse had picked up somewhere under the old ache in her shoulder. "Make promises you're going to use later as leverage." "I don't make promises," he said. "I make arrangements. There's a difference." "Comforting," she said again. "In the way a loaded. You already used that line. It's a good line. It bears repeating." Neither of them moved for a moment that stretched longer than it had any right to. The drink sat between them, untouched, the ice slowly losing its shape the way certain resolves do, quietly, without announcement. His thumb had not moved from her wrist. Neither had she asked him to move it. Somewhere outside the office, a delivery truck idled at the curb, its engine the only sound in a building that otherwise held its breath the way the back room had, months ago, before she'd known what his hands looked like when they weren't folded in judgment of someone else's debt. "If this were a smart decision," she said, quiet, not quite meeting his eyes, "I'd have left already. You're still here. I'm aware. Is that a problem?" "It's going to be," she said, "eventually. Everything with you turns into a problem eventually. I've read the file, metaphorically. I know how this genre ends for women who work for men like you." "This isn't a genre," he said. "It's Tuesday." She laughed once, short and real, surprised out of her, the way laughter sometimes is when it has no business showing up at all. "God, you're a menace even when you're trying to be charming." "I wasn't trying. That's worse." "Go home, Vega," he said finally, and there was something almost gentle buried under the flatness of it. "Your cat's waiting. He's diabetic. He's always waiting. It's basically his whole personality. Go home anyway." She went. She did not look back at the door, though every part of her wanted to, and she told herself, on the bus home, smelling of diesel and rain and, faintly now, of cedar that wasn't hers, that this was manageable, that 2,000 a week and dental and a cat with proper food did not have to mean anything more than exactly what it said on paper. She almost believed it. The call came 4 days later, at 3 a.m., which by now felt less like an hour and more like a summons that had learned her name. "There's a problem," Fermin said, and this time his voice had none of its usual dry humor in it. "It's not a device. It's Iker. He didn't go home. He went to Ektor." Mari sat up in the dark of her one-room apartment, Sergeant grumbling at the disturbance from the foot of the bed, and looked at the water stain on her ceiling that still, if you squinted, looked like the coast of somewhere she'd never been. "Where's Nazario?" she said. "That's the problem," Fermin said. "Nobody knows yet, and there's a device involved after all, just not where we thought." "Where?" "His car, the one he takes to the airport Thursdays." A pause, the specific pause of a man deciding how much truth a phone line could carry. "He's supposed to leave for it in 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Mari did the arithmetic without meaning to. The drive time to the garage where his cars were kept, the time it would take Fermin to stall him, the time it had taken her, the first time, to read a box she'd never seen before under conditions considerably calmer than whatever this was going to be. "Does he know?" she said. "No, he thinks it's a normal Thursday. Keep it that way as long as you can. If he finds out and gets stubborn about proving he's not scared, we lose time we don't have. You know him that well already." "I know men like him well enough," she said, already pulling on her coat, already reaching for the small canvas bag she'd started keeping by the door without ever admitting to herself why. A bag with exactly the tools a person needs when a phone call like this one finally comes. "Pride kills more of them than bullets do." "There's a car coming for you," Fermin said. 2 minutes out. Make it faster than 2 minutes. It's already faster than it should legally be going." Outside her window, the bus that ground its brakes on schedule every morning wasn't due for another 4 hours, and the street had that particular pre-dawn stillness that belongs to nobody, the hour when even the city seems to be holding something in reserve. Sergeant watched her from the bed with the flat, unimpressed patience of an animal who had seen her leave in a hurry before and had learned, correctly, that she always came back. "Stay," she told him, which was unnecessary, since he had nowhere else to be and no interest in going there even if he did, but saying it out loud steadied something in her chest that the last 90 seconds had loosened. Headlights swept across the ceiling of her apartment, once, twice, and stopped. The car had arrived faster than 2 minutes, exactly the way Fermin had promised, and somewhere underneath the fear sitting cold in her stomach, she registered, with a clarity that surprised her, that some part of her had already decided the answer to a question nobody had asked her out loud yet, whether this was still just an arrangement, whether 2,000 a week and dental had ever really been the whole of it, or whether somewhere between a bomb under a table and a thumb resting too long on her wrist, the paperwork had quietly stopped mattering. She was already reaching for her coat. "I'll take the cat food out of the fridge before I go," she said, mostly to herself, mostly because saying something ordinary out loud was the only way she knew to keep her hands from shaking. It goes bad if it sits too long. That's where we're going to leave Marisol Vega tonight. Coat half on, phone against her ear, a diabetic cat named Sergeant watching her from the foot of a second-hand mattress, about to walk back into a life that pays better than dishwashing and costs more than money. Nazario Cruz built an empire on never once raising his voice, and it took a woman who scraped plates for a living to make him go quiet for an entirely different reason. Whether that quiet turns into something that survives daylight, whether Iker's mistake becomes the fuse that finally reaches Nazario himself, and whether Mari gets to him in time, or gets there only to find out what kind of man he really becomes when the clock runs out on someone he can't afford to lose, that's the part we don't know yet either. Do you think she saves him because the arrangement says she has to, or because somewhere between a bomb and a bottle of good scotch, it stopped being an arrangement at all? Drop your predictions in the comments. I want to hear where you think this goes. If you liked riding along with Mari and Nazario tonight, do me a favor, like the video, share it with someone who needs a story to fall asleep to, and subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss the next chapter. This one's far from over.